It's recording, and good morning, good evening, good afternoon, depending where you are. This is Kubernetes open source SIG API Machinery bi-weekly meeting. Today is October 19th, 2022. We are heading right into Q4 of this year. It flew by very quickly. We have two great topics today, and I want to thank the people that helps us every week, have every 2 weeks interesting things to discuss. So Andrew, you're the first one. I will give it up to you.
Yeah, thanks. So a couple of weeks ago, we updated the kube-apiserver identity cap in hopes to try to land that for beta in 1.26. And one of the criteria we added was to reach consensus on the lease identity format. So I tried to articulate all the options we had discussed on Slack and the pros and cons of each approach in the agenda notes. So I think after getting more familiar with the code, I'm personally in favor of the hostname one, or the kube-apiserver -hostname, for three reasons. The first one being that I don't buy the argument around wanting to run multiple API servers on the same host. And even if you did, you can work around that by assigning different pod names for the kubelet managed static pods. So I feel like there's like a reasonable workaround for that. Second being, if we're really concerned about hostname exposure, there are already places where the lease identifier contains hostname, such as like with leader election with kubecontroller manager and kubescheduler. And lastly, after digging through a bunch of the garbage collection logic, it seems like creating and requiring a garbage collection of leases for every kube API restart does seem expensive, because every time you garbage collect a lease, it requires a relist of every storage version object and updating its status to remove the lease that no longer exists. And I know Mo and David had some additional thoughts regarding the KMSVT use cases, so I'll also let them.
Question,
clarification.
Let me quickly.
1 second, Mike. The thing with two API servers on one system, I'm pretty sure that we had at least one person who really wanted to do that, to the extent that they added a feature to let API servers share the port. The reason they wanted to do that was that they wanted to reboot or like start one and then stop the other on the same machine without having a outage. But that was been quite a while. I don't know if they still do that, but I assume somebody does. Okay,
clarification. Yes, I wanted to
Mike is next.
Yes, I just wanted clarification on the solution for that. I'm not quite sure I followed. Is the idea here that the lease name is actually the pod name?
Oh, Kubernetes uses the pod name as the container's host name by default, unless you set the host name field in the container, in which case Kubernetes uses that.
So we're talking about the host name inside
this is implemented
pod
by kubelet. If you run API server in like systemd or something, then you don't get that feature.
So specifically, when we say host name here, we mean the host name. Oh gosh. Yeah.
So API server uses the syscall to acquire your one's own host name, whatever that is.
All right. So I understand the solution now. Thank you.
Daniel, on the person that wanted to like reuse the same port, in that case, is that user expecting the hostname to be the same between those two things? Because it's like they're like. I don't think they care about the hostname for that use case. I don't think they cared about the hostname. I guess I'm trying to logically understand, what would that user expect to happen? Would they expect a new lease to be created for the new API server, or do they consider those like oh yeah, that's a good question. If I were doing that, I would consider the second API server to be an extension of the first API server and give them both the same name and hope that they didn't fight too much during the brief amount of time when they were both alive.
That's awesome. So hang on, thinking that through with KMS or even with storage. If we think it through with storage, it's gonna be terrible. I'm not confident that does good things. I also think I'm probably okay telling a person, if you wish to run two at once, we would expect you to give them unique names. And even if we didn't support it as an argument, I would find, does setting spec hostname work? Is it pod spec hostname?
Yeah.
That's
I think
reasonable.
I think it's not that hard to set that, even if you're not running inside kubelet.
So one of the things that I was interested related to this is, are we going to go for graceful lease release? And I think we do not want to delete our lease when we shut down. We want to leave that up to GC. We did settle on that then. I know I confused the issue by bringing it up, but it didn't exist the first time we did this cap. And it does exist now. And so I just want to have an explicit, like, we will not gracefully release.
I think if it would be a poor choice if we were going with stable identifiers to put the lease down.
Actually, can we release and not delete it? I think we can.
So I think we should start without graceful release. And if so, the case in which that would be useful, like imagine you're scaling up or down your control plane by adding API server replicas, and you know that you're removing one and it's not coming back. It could be handy to just remove your lease completely, and instead of letting it be garbage collected. But it's not that big of a deal, and I think we shouldn't implement that unless a lot of people ask for it.
Okay. Then I think I also like kube-apiserver with a host name, giving us a fixed name.
So are we leaning towards basically no config knobs, and when the API server comes up, you know, however you set up your environment, whatever host name that process sees is what's going to try to claim. If you've done horrible things and there's multiple that are going to fight for it, I don't know, we'll have a metric that tells you that they're fighting.
Or if you've put PII in your host name, that's going to broadcast that to everybody.
Yeah. I think that
but that's already going to happen, as we discussed.
Yeah.
Oh, it does. Does it already happen in some way?
For the scheduler and the controller manager, maybe not the API server. But.
Oh, they put that in there? I see.
Okay.
They might be in different containers and not have the same host name as API server.
In terms of detecting that this went bad, I remember one of the PRR answers was you will be able to look and see that the post start hook did not finish. And that seems valid to detect someone who had a problem, right? They had a problem. Their API server was, oh, you wouldn't be able to tell a fight. They would both think they had it.
Mm-hmm.
Huh.
Also, what's the expected behavior if like an API server crashes and it's immediately restarted by whatever watchdog is trying to keep it up? Should it like immediately try to hold, like, is it like just not observable that lease was technically lost for a little bit because the process that was holding it got killed somehow? And
well, I think the point of leases is they don't do that.
Yeah, we just decided we don't want to like try and gracefully shut down. Like the point is to keep the lease operable to reduce churn in the rest of the system.
But no, the point was not about graceful, right? He said crash, so there's no question of graceful. But the point of a lease is that it's a timed, time thing. You take it for a while, so presumably a brief crash and recovery will happen while it's already held anyway, and you don't need to do anything.
Right.
That's what I would expect as well, and that would be another reason to have this fixed name.
Right, and the principle is we want to reduce churn in the rest of the system.
Yeah, I mean, I think the human ergonomics of a fixed name are nice. There seems to be at least, some quantifiable benefit to just let's not just recycle a bunch of objects with basically no op updates that do actually change stuff and cause people to care, and maybe run storage migrations or something, and just otherwise waste IO on the system for no good reason. So all that seems like good reasons. Daniel, do you remember why you went? The KEP said it was going to be fixed. Then the implementation went to UUID, and now we're saying we're going to actually undo that and go back. So
I vaguely recall having a conversation with Howe. I think we were worried about exposing the host name, that we weren't sure that it wouldn't be PII.
If we're still concerned about that and we don't,
I'm not. I don't think I'm concerned about that. Like we're gonna document this.
I guess I would ask if we want to avoid maybe having to care about documenting it, we could still use the host name, just hash it first.
But then you lose the human ergonomics.
Yeah, I mean, you get still the stability. You just don't get as easy understanding of the map.
Yeah, I mean, and right, it doesn't have to be the system host name, right? It can be the container, the host name reported by the container API servers in, which people can set without too much trouble, even if you're not using kubelet. So, like, I think that's as reasonable a way as any to set this bit of information.
It seems reasonable to me. I am flexible for either one. I agree that they would handle my stability concerns.
I mean, if you just imagine like a random process running somewhere and it wants to identify itself to other processes in the network or whatever, a host name is a pretty natural way to identify yourself.
And we're just okay. We talked about it just a little while, where we're okay if you accidentally give the same host name to separate distinct processes that you can't actually tell like which one has it. Or actually, they'll both think they have it, I guess.
Because they both think they have the same name.
Yeah, they both think they have the same name, and it says they're holding it, so they'll be like, "Cool, I'm holding it," and that's fine.
Okay, yeah, maybe we should talk about that scenario a little bit more, because imagine somebody's misconfigured it, like they hard-coded a host name in their pod configuration, and they blasted the same pod configuration to all of their control plane nodes. And so they've got like 3 API servers, and they all think they're called the same thing. That's configuration error, but we probably, it would defeat the purpose. Yeah, so we probably need to make sure those things don't think that they're called the same. That's a good point.
I think somewhere in all of our designs, or at least designs related to running storage migration, there's going to have to be like the expected number of API servers at the current point in time. I think you need to at least know that, to know that everybody is present.
I forget exactly the format of leases, but suppose you could add, like, I don't know, a label or something with a UUID, and it would be fine for that thing to change every time. It's just if API server looks at the lease and it sees that it's got some other UUID, it overwrites it with its currently generated one. And if it keeps having to do that, then we know that we're fighting over the lease with some other system. How's that? That at least detects
so on a restart, there would be churn, like
right.
So turn on the lease, but not on any other object.
Right.
Okay.
So the idea is to put it in something that's not the name, so the name stays the same. And if people fight over this label, I mean, you've got a problem if multiple API servers think that they're the same thing.
Yep. I'm just trying to think of myself explaining this in a way that doesn't say that the label that you just described was actually another lease. Right, like I have a label, I'm going to look at this label, I'm going to make sure I don't fight over it with somebody else. If I am fighting over it with somebody else, I'm not going to write my data out.
What if it was like much simpler logic, which is that if you're doing an update to fix that, you just increment a metric counter and that's it. Like you keep doing it, you don't actually change your behavior at all. You just say, hey, this update, at least part of the reason I'm issuing this update to this lease is because this random UUID is different, and I increment my metric. And if you see this metric going really high up, it's not working as you expect.
Okay, I think that could do.
Yeah. Like, we're not saying we need to change the actual like mechanic of the leaseholding. We're just saying we just need to know if two API servers are fighting.
Yeah, observability is the first step. I guess the question is if we need to do more than that, or if making it observable is enough.
I mean, your audit logs
Probably
will
agree
show
with
the fight.
observable for beta, and then we'll figure out when we actually use it if we need to do more.
Yeah,
Is
that's
that good enough, Mo, or is that not going to be good enough for your purposes?
Oh no, I think that's I'm not worried about this because I will not make this configuration mistake. I am because I am aware of it, so I'm not going to do it. I'm more trying to help others understand that they've gotten here. And so like metrics, if you're looking, you'll notice. Audit events, if you're looking, you'll notice. Granted, leases might be exempted from audit events because they're noisy.
Yeah, I think they are. I think API server, if it notices this number increasing rapidly, needs to put a warning or an error in its own logs. People do sometimes look at those.
Yeah, the metric is an easier thing for people to find.
Yeah, the metric is easier.
Okay.
No, I think I'm comfortable saying that, hey, this is just a misconfiguration. It's just if you give someone a reasonable chance of finding it, hopefully they notice.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, you've got to give your API servers different identities, or unless you're like deliberately trying to do the like takeover thing that I described. But I think that's going to be a pretty rare case.
For like the purpose of like storage migration, regardless of if it's for key rotation or storage schema changes, does any of this need to have like the number of expected API servers? So that way on the outside, if you're looking at storage version and there's only one API server because the three that are configured have the same host name?
I'm fairly against trying to program that in. Like the original coordination mechanism that API server used to put its endpoints in the endpoints table was based on everybody added their own IP if it wasn't in the list and truncated the list to the number that they expected. And basically everybody hated that system. And so we went to this like, yeah, I mean, this is kind of a evolution of the desire to not use that system and have API servers figure out how many of them there are. If we think it is going to be hard for people to name their API servers distinctly, then I'm not sure. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, I think the only concern I have is if you were in this misconfigured state, like the encryption at rest stuff might, like, you might trigger rotations earlier than you should because you think the servers have converged because you think there's only one.
Right.
And like one of the things I had in at least some of the alpha reasoning was like the controller that's going to like kick off this thing has to know the number, because until it sees that fixed number and they're holding for some amount of time, it just doesn't do anything because it doesn't know if they're ready for the change. I don't know if that's okay. I guess
would that be something you would expect to build into the system that you're writing to manage the keys, or would you expect to build it in here? And if the cleanup, how long would the cleanup have to be given stable names for you to have confidence that the server you're waiting for was never coming back?
Right. So I think when I originally wrote some of that, there was some specific numbers I had written based on forget exactly what, but Andrew, do you remember how long these leases are held for? Like, I guess like if we,
I think it's an hour.
Like, so if we hard code that number instead of making it configurable and make it something you can rely on, and we are okay with something probing the leases based on that label, and thus they can, like, something that's not built into the system necessarily, doing that probe. I think it would be fine, right? You'd be able to find the leases, and then, if they've all been held for some amount of time that's greater than small number of minutes, but maybe less than an hour. I feel like that's okay.
I mean, depending on how worried we are about this, if API server detects the condition, we could make it not like maybe not write to the storage versions object.
At the
Or
risk of making this more complicated, are we okay splitting the lease name from the holder identity and saying that for lease names we use kube-apiserver and for holder identity we have UIDs? Right, that way you would have something that was persistent, but it would handle the restart case fairly gracefully. It would effectively be that second label you were talking about, Daniel.
yeah.
And it would cause the post start hook to like delay indefinitely, which would hit the thing that Andrew had already said. You can look at this and say, if you don't go ready, this is how you know why it has happened.
Yeah. Basically, we'd be running instead of one. Basically, we'd be running a leader election per API server name.
Yeah.
That seems okay though. I think you get better ergonomics, right? Because it's unlikely to come up and become healthy if the fighting is happening. So it kind of dies loudly, and then the person goes and fixes it.
Yeah, that would be kind of nice. If a failure mode for API server, it's like I can't lock my name, so I'm just not going to start. That makes it not work in the you deliberately want two things to have the same name, but maybe we shouldn't let people do that anyway. You can just name
I'm
them
leaning
differently.
towards I don't want them to do it anyway, just because I am concerned that I'm a little concerned about the storage version, because that could create churn, right? You do storage migration when you don't need to. I'm more concerned about the KMS usage, where I decide I'm okay to remove something and now I can no longer decode my data.
Yeah.
Right.
So, and I'm willing to bet that the person who wanted to do that is Stefan. He's not here. But he would have wanted to do it to reduce API server downtime during graceful release timing.
So did Stefan want to do that for OpenShift, David? Like, do you need this?
If I'm choosing which problem I am going to have, I am likely to say I would rather have a reliable way to express the identity on the server than a convenient way to run on the same port.
Yeah, I mean, I guess basically what we just discussed. I think I'd be comfortable if that was like updated in the cap, and we just said, yeah, that's great, let's do that.
Yeah. Okay. So on a restart, I come back, I see my old lease with my old holder identity. How do I know that old holder identity is a former iteration of me and not some other API server that I'm fighting with?
So the host name on the lease object, right?
Yeah, so the host name on the release object gives you the right lease that you're going to acquire. I think if we did this, we would actually use a graceful release that does not delete the lease, right? So the lease object would still be present, but we would remove our holder identity. And so when you
restart, so what if we crash and restart?
Then you have to wait for that
that's real bad though, right? Because
it's not good.
Aren't these hanging around for an hour?
No, it's two different processes. One is saying if this lease name disappears, I have cleanup to do on the storage version, and that takes an hour for me to decide to delete the entries from the storage version.
Okay.
Then we have a separate piece that says I hold this lease as the holder for X many seconds. And,
okay.
And so X could be.
Okay. No, that works good. That works good. So we're going to hold it for like 10 seconds or 20 seconds or something. We take that long to start anyway. So
I still think that on every restart, there is going to be some system churn because we use the holder identity in the status of the storage version API. But like there's not that many objects, so it's probably not a big deal.
Well, should we
can change
use
that.
the holder identity, or should we use the lease name? Right.
yeah, we should use the lease name. We should change that.
Or I guess. Yeah.
Okay, I added some action items I'll take at the bottom of the agenda. So I'll send the cat PR.
Yeah. Yeah, this is, so we've effectively changed from a model where we have like 3 names in the cluster to a model where we have 3 hats, and each hat can only be worn by one name at a time.
Yes.
I think that's an improvement. Okay, great. Should we go to the next?
Yes. Thank you, Andrew, for capturing some of the discussion. And then Daniel, next one is yours. Do you want me to open this one?
Sure. In fact, I will open it on my screen too, so I can. Let's see. So we talked about this 2 meetings ago, and we talked about it in the SIG auth, the meeting after that, and basically the designs the last time this came around didn't fulfill a second obligation, which is the ability to add a new field without including that field in the existing broad permission for rights. So we've come up with a design that addresses that and is slightly simpler. The other concern that Tim Hawken had was that if we don't want a system where we change version and that implies that you need different permissions, because that is too much burden for system administrators. So the basic design now is to add to schema per field a tag describing the permission for that field and whether that permission is like you can grant that permission to anybody and then they can edit that field, or if it's, even if you have the regular permission, you still can't edit that field unless you also have the special permission. So there's the 2 modes. Yeah, so it becomes a part of the API design to describe what permission, if any, you don't have to have one, what permission goes with a particular field. And this means some implications for like how you describe the permission. So instead of, let's see, where's that section? Instead of a system that I was describing before where the permission is generated from the field path, now basically there's a style guide for how you set up a permission. The one I made up in the KEP, which is completely open to change at the moment, is the permission name has to be a noun, should be in a lower camel case. It should refer to like a conceptual attribute, not a field name. That helps you reuse the permission in other contexts. Right, like you can imagine some permission making sense for, I don't know, like both pod and like some sort of networking thing or some sort of storage thing, right? So you want to grant that permission generally over both of those types instead of generating an additional permission, right? That the more permissions you have, the more work it is for system administrators to figure out what is going on and administer this thing. The permission shouldn't reference all the ancestor fields, right? So instead of saying, like pod.spec. Node name, you should just say like node assignment. And you get a hierarchical system by assigning permissions to the, like, so like spec has a permission associated with it, and that if you have that permission, that covers everything inside it. right? So that's how you get a hierarchical system. So I don't know. I don't want to go through the whole design because it's kind of long. But if anyone has questions, now's a good time. David.
Can you go through an example of how you would have an exclude of a label pattern from the generic privilege? So I want labels start with a pattern security.openshift.io to be excluded from the generic update.
In the design as written, you can't do that. People were only asking about new fields. I didn't even think about labels with specific prefixes as being equivalent to new fields. And since the permission system is now going to be part of the spec, and since the built-ins, including metadata, are shipped with Kubernetes, there wouldn't be a way to configure that. If that's important to you, then we can see if maybe we can figure out a way.
And I was trying to figure out how to do it. I thought I'd be able to do it. What if I said I want to have an exclude of certain patterns on leads?
That would be possible because it's a new field. Certain patterns.
I only want certain patterns.
Certain patterns. I'd have to think about that. That wasn't the request that I had been anticipating. The problem with exclude, it's difficult to support both include and exclude on the same field.
Okay, I'll let Mo go and I'll think about whether the include and exclude on the same field is actually the problem that I'm running into in my head.
Okay, Mo.
So let's see. I had a few things, and some of this is like really small. Like on some of the implementation details, Daniel, that you had about how like some of the wiring would work. I think I would want the wiring to be written in a way that if it's using something like context to pass state, that it always passes some state, and if that state is missing, that it just hard fails as an internal error saying, I don't know what checks I need to make, instead of like, oh, there's nothing. Sure. It must mean it's like the old way.
No, yeah, that's great. That's great. This is like the minimum viable right. Design to get the point across. That wasn't intended to be complete in that detail. Yeah, but that's good feedback. I'll put it in when I do a revision, whenever that is.
On the part about where you're like, actually it's actually almost on screen right now, where it says marking existing fields this way would break existing clients because authz is fully configurable. One of the ideas that David had shared last time was basically retroactively adding that stuff to like the Bootstrap RBAC policy to then allow an administrator.
Yeah, I think I actually mentioned that. We can totally solve the problem for RBAC, right? Like we can take it away from the general permission and add it in RBAC. The problem is that doesn't help people who aren't using RBAC to configure their systems. And
right.
Yeah.
So my thought on that was there's two things. One, we could just hard require you to start using RBAC, so that should just be a thing. But fine, if you don't want to make that strong assertion, we could make it so that when RBAC is not configured, there's just a new authorizer at the end of the chain that takes those legacy permissions and just allows them to happen. So that way, you haven't lost anything. The permissions, like you were already allowed to do it in the old system.
Okay, so when it sees a request for this new permission, when it sees a request, when it sees a request for a new permission, it translates that into a request for an old permission, and asks like goes through the chain again or something.
Yeah, it could, I guess. It's something like that. I haven't, but something to retroactively like sort of do it the other way.
Okay.
Mo, I'm not sure that handles a case where someone was using a webhook authorizer and the webhook authorizer would return no opinion, but nothing else would grant permission. So we'll get a default deny. I'm not adverse to trying to think of a solution there, but
Yeah.
um,
Yeah, it might be a little bit complex to get it to work. I do think it's tractable, and the idea of allowing environments to tighten this down sort of retroactively is appealing to me.
So along those same lines, one thing I've considered but haven't written into this is like, if a system administrator does want to go through the trouble of locking something down extra, and that's no problem for them because they know how their auth system is configured, and they can just add in the permissions to the people who should have it while taking it away from everybody. That part is easy. The problem, the thing that this design doesn't address is that like the schemas for the built-in types are the same for everybody and not changeable. So if we want an administrator to be able to lock down labels in a special way in their system, we would need like a way for them to override the tags that we ship on the built-in schemas or something like that, which I don't have written down because I don't want to do that unless it's absolutely necessary.
I'm not 100% sure if I just followed what you just said.
There are 3 cases of types, Mo. So there's one where you are defining your own schema. You have a field on your schema, and you're going to decide you need a permission to set this.
So
there
CMD
is the case where you are reusing a schema somebody else defined. So you're either reusing a pod spec, or you are reusing maybe meta v1, which is very common. And you want for your type, your embedded version of meta v1 to have different rules. And then there's the third case where you're a cluster administrator. The person who has defined the schema did not define it as you wished it would happen. And now you as a cluster administrator want to lock down fine-grained fields that were identified in the schema, but not identified in the manner that you would like.
Yeah, okay, I follow now.
Yeah. Okay. Should we let Tim say something?
Yeah, let's go.
Do this breadth first, Tim.
Yeah, sorry. I'm concerned a little bit about what the user experience on this is going to be. If you have like multiple different permissions needed for different parts of the request, and maybe some are deny and some are like the fail open or fail closed kind of approach, and maybe there's some hierarchy to it.
Yeah, let me clarify a couple things. One is, part of the point of putting this in the schema is that we will be able to generate a list of all the permissions that there are in the system, and link back to the types that they apply to, which maybe one permission may apply in multiple places. Okay, so that's one. The other answer is, like, let me be a little bit clearer about how the deny system works. It's not a deny system. There is no denying. The two options are either, okay, so yeah, actually let's just walk through where did I write this, the overall flow, which is, yeah, so the first step, a request comes into the API server. The first step is we check do you have put patch create, do you have a mutating permission? If you do, that's the regular permission. We'll mark it as such in the context or whatever, like Mo wants. And if you have that, we don't need to check the specific field permissions, except for the ones which are marked as exceptional. Yeah, that's step 3, I think. Yeah. If you don't have, on the other hand, if you don't have the regular permission, then we're going to check the granular permissions for everything that you are attempting to change, right? So it's like the regular permission gives you, 99% of the fields, and for a couple fields there may be yet another permission that you need. But if you don't even have the regular permission, then you might still be able to make the change if you have the special permissions. I feel like I still didn't explain that very well, but hopefully the highlighted bit on the screen makes it clearer. Right, but at no point are we looking at what you have and then denying that. So it maintains the current it's like positive framing of RBAC.
Okay.
Yeah, if you can think of a better way to describe this, then yeah, feel free to let me know or send a poll to my branch here. Mo?
So if you, like, let's say there's a built-in type like pod v1 and pod v2, are we saying that we, the authors of this, would be very careful to make sure that semantically equivalent fields require the same permission, and if we don't do that, terrible things will happen?
Yes, and in order to help people do that, the documentation is going to have to make a list of the fields. So you change the API type. So if you make a conflicting field, you would probably see in this list, if it is reasonably organized, you would probably see that you've made a conflicting permission. If you fail to add a permission that makes sense in the context of the field, I don't know that there's anything that I can do to help you with that. So there is actually a harder problem with this, which is CRD authors.
Yeah,
if everybody goes off, yeah, okay. If everybody goes off and makes their own set of permissions, it's not likely to work together. And somewhere near the bottom of this, I have a set of ideas on how we can do that. I think it's below this, Fede. If you keep going down a little bit, yeah, it's by the style guide. Yeah, so I suggested either put a registry file in the repository for third-party authors to, just make an entry there, sorted alphabetically so you don't get too many conflicts or something. But go record that you're using some permission, what it's about, to make it possible for other people to use it. And the other option is third-party authors prefix their permissions with something unique to them, like namespace it. And if anybody has better ideas than those, I would be happy to change them, because I don't think those are very good ideas. But yeah, I think there's some sort of problem there. I think the built-in types are fine because we can generate them from the docs and put them in one place in a list. And I think humans are fairly good at like looking at, like, we just don't mark that file as like generated, don't review. We mark it as please review the changes to this file, even though it is generated. And I think people are going to be relatively good at noticing that you've, made a duplicate permission or failed to use some already existing permission, etc., or have produced a permission that is a bad one because it's only ever going to be applicable in this particular case and will be impossible to reuse. And so you're just cluttering up the space. I think that's something that human reviewers can do. I don't know how to do that for random CRDs.
The thought I have in my head, I have absolutely no idea how to apply to CRDs, but for a built-in API, since we do go through the hub type, could you actually define the permission on the hub type and then have it actually funnel back out to the associated fields or associated concept?
I think it's not that easy. You certainly can't get the same permission applied to different kinds by that mechanism. You might be able to take care of different versions, but I think it is less magical to just have humans specify it in all the places where it goes.
So is the expectation that, like, before this thing goes beta, we're going to manually annotate every one of the built-in types?
Yeah, the expectation is that we will add these to at least the fields mentioned in this KEP, which is mostly metadata and conditions, and there's like a couple of fields in pod. I think mechanically we could also do spec if people think it is going to be generically useful to have a permission that means spec and nothing else. That one's easy to do mechanically, and after that, like I think that's enough to like get this off the ground. And if people want to add more, they can just add them over time. And I think it's not going to, like, if you come up with a use case, it will no longer be like a big deal to do this. You'll just add the stuff to the schema and check your changes in, and you're good to go. Right? You don't have a lot of manual, as opposed to sub-resources where it's currently quite a lot of boilerplate and some not so boilerplate code to make a sub-resource.
If you add this after the fact, we're implicitly saying that those new things cannot be special in the sense that you can't retroactively say.
Right, you wouldn't be able to retroactively make fields excluded from the regular permission. Unless we come up with a system for doing that. Yeah, David?
I've been trying to decide if I thought that there were cases where we would want to exclude labels or annotations from a default update permission, or convince myself in either direction. And I've been unsuccessful at convincing myself that it's definitely not needed, which is not the same as convincing myself that it definitely is needed. It just means that I'm those three cases that I described earlier.
Yeah.
Exploring what those three cases mean and comparing it against, say, I can think of a couple either labels or annotations we have on namespaces related to scheduling, where you can say this is the default node selector for my namespace, and you must fit inside of it. And an update to namespace permission maybe shouldn't include that. And that's one example. There are other ones that are OpenShift specific.
Yeah,
And
so like just translating that into the terms in this design, to make that work, you'd have to make, because it's still a like positively framed system like RBAC, so you would have to like first somehow separate the permission for that specific label from the permission for everything else, and then grant it only to the person that you wanted and exclude it from the regular permission.
So
that doesn't work too well with this like hierarchical system.
If you leave aside the mechanics of expressing the authorization choice and say somebody built an authorizer that can do this, what I'm trying to figure out is whether the minimum amount of design that we have is simply a what if we asked, does the user have the permission to set any of these labels, and we just list them all. It would be extremely expensive with a webhook API today, because you would list every label on every request, but conceptually would it give us what we wanted? And then if we built a mass authorization check where you have like a slice and you just issue the slice, would it do what? Would that function? Would that solve that functional case? And then could we decide, is it worth the additional effort to do this or not? And I'm not making a declaration here. I really don't know. But I think I managed to boil it down to that is the question that I have.
I think that would work. It would only be as expensive as the number of labels with values that are changing. It would definitely be like extra effort, because that's not a natural thing at the moment.
I'm not. I would like to explore the idea first and then decide that the trade-off either is or isn't worth that additional effort. I don't know sitting right here.
So honestly, if I had that problem, I think a more natural way of solving it is with a it would be much easier to describe that situation as a forbid thing than as a permit thing. Right, that would be more natural.
In terms of if you were expressing policy for it versus in terms of of implementing how, at what layer we would ask for the request, where the policy would be written. For instance, the thing I just described, that policy would not be written into the schema of the label, right? Because the idea is that the schema of the label is immutable for every custom resource using it, right? And that may not be appropriate for what we have actually created.
Yeah, and you also need the parameterized permission to not be recursively inheriting from the non-parameterized permission, right? In your condition, you don't want a general permission to write labels to imply that you have a permission to write a specific label.
Yeah, that is true. And there was one permissions model that we did explore that would have allowed that, but I will admit that was very difficult to understand. The first cut of RBAC had.
Yeah, let's see. While phrasing it in, yeah, I think I have to think about how to actually do that.
Can we describe the problem first?
I mean, the problem is basically there's an unbounded number of possible labels, right? So the problem is to describe like the problem is to fail to say yes for specific labels while saying yes for an unbounded, unspecified set of labels.
And it's made worse by the fact that the schema author does not necessarily know what labels or annotations are going to get applied. I'm sorry, Noah has his hand up, and I just haven't even been paying attention.
And you have to like also not give all the enclosing permissions.
No, okay. Sometimes you want it that way, and sometimes you don't.
Right.
So I trying to parse the problem that we're talking about. To me, I think labels and annotations, if you step back and think of them as like distinct Kubernetes objects, what we're basically saying is, hey, I want the ability to at any time retroactively say something inside of this object is now special. I think that's basically what you're asking for, right? Which is that, hey, it doesn't matter that the top level field says you can have anything in labels. This thing here retroactively says you can't do that.
I don't even know if I would agree that it's retroactive. I think the fact that the object meta is immutable for CRD authors means that even your first creation of this can end up in a place where you have no way to describe it.
Right. I think the retroactive part of that is the fact that you can't, there's no way for you to actually go far back enough because you don't control the schema. Okay. You can't actually go far enough to be at the beginning of time because we, the Kubernetes developers, start the time already before you see the code, basically.
Yeah. Okay, then yeah, I can agree with that phrasing.
I don't know if there's a way to build this without some order deny logic. My head hurts just thinking about it.
Mo, you've actually made me think of an alternative system for describing these things. Like if we figured that, okay, basically a label is an object, what if we made the request what if we made the permission request substituting the label's key for the object's name, and like the object's kind becomes label, then it's easier to see how you would configure such a thing in your auth system. I don't think that it would be easier to understand, though. Okay, so David, how would you, what can I write down to help you decide if you really need to see, if you really desperately need this or not?
Do you mind if I try to open a PR to your branch where I try to describe?
Yeah, go for it. Yeah.
Just thinking like I'm willing to do that to try to describe what's in my head, and then once we can agree that that's like that description makes sense, then trying to then trade off, like, is it worth it to try to fix this?
Yeah.
And I'll try to come up with some examples. The node selector one definitely occurs to me because it's a spot where effectively, oh great, there's something highlighted. It's a spot where, for instance, the namespace API, different SIGs have not been able to add fields to it, but they have added meanings for labels that are then used in admission. And the auth SIG has done this for pod security admission, for instance. It's the basis of how that works. And should access to updating a namespace give you the ability to override safety permissions on every node? I mean, probably not.
Yeah. So I think you can actually do the thing you described with this as written. You just have to like not give anybody the enclosing permissions, and like list out the permissions for every label separately.
Okay. Mo wants to respond to me saying SIG auth was the bad actor.
Or your permission system has to understand like a wildcard, right? So some people get like every label. Yeah. If your permission system can do it, you can do it with this. I think if we were going to promise something like that, we need to make a checker or a verification system to like for a given actor, like do the check and tell you whether or not they actually have the ability to set a label or not, because it's too hard to configure and be sure that you've configured what you think you've configured. Mo, one more thing, and then I think we're out of time.
Is there some way to make like labels and annotations, or maybe even whole objects, like have them be in the default state of the outer permission doesn't grant inner permission?
You mean like per object?
The on David's you cannot set the security.openshift.io thing. Like, is there a way we could express that basically made it that you would have to somehow, I guess it doesn't work because I think you'd have to enumerate everything somehow up front, and it just is intractable to start that way. Yeah. I don't know if I have anything useful to say.
All right. Seems like we'll be having a follow-up. Maybe we'll continue this in SIG auth. Is it next week or 3 weeks from now? I'm not sure.
Well, November 9th is the next SIG auth.
Yeah, so I think that's 3 weeks from now. So we've got lots of time to get ready. All right.
Very good. Yeah, we are at time. There is KubeCon next week. We have a deep dive session, and then it's going to be public, so you can watch it. I think some people here in the call are going to be present. I know Joe is going to be there and some others. So have a good KubeCon if you're going, and we'll see you next time. Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.